싱하이밍 대사는 상습적으로 우리 대한민국을 무시하는 그런 오만한 태도를 보여온 사람입니다. 본 의원은 이번에 PNG를 지정해서 싱하이밍 대상을 추방해야 된다고 생각합니다.
The trade relationship between South Korea and China has become increasingly complex. South Korea's exports to China have been on a downward trend. This change is driven by both market and political factors. Data released by the South Korean Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy on June 6 reveals a continuous decline in South Korea's exports to China over several months. In the first 5 months of this year alone, South Korea's total exports to China plummeted to a mere 49.7 billion, representing a 27.3% year-on-year decline. Looking back, China's share in South Korea's total exports has been decreasing year by year, dropping from 25.3% in 2021 to 22.8% in 2022 and further down to 19.5% in the first quarter of this year. Simultaneously, there has been a dramatic shift in the trade surplus between China and South Korea. In the past, South Korea has consistently enjoyed a trade surplus with China, but in January and February of this year, that surplus suddenly turned into a deficit, reaching 5.074 billion. This marked the first time since the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1992 that China became South Korea's largest trade deficit country. A similar pattern emerges in the total trade volume between the two countries. Chinese data shows that since 1992, the China-South Korea trade volume has increased 40-fold, surpassing 360 billion in 2021. As we enter 2023, the total trade volume between China and South Korea has begun to decline. Data from the General Administration of Customs of China indicates that in the first quarter, January to March, the bilateral trade volume was 77 billion, a 14.3% year-on-year decrease. In May, this downward trend intensified with a negative growth rate of 21.6%. So what are the driving forces behind these changes? According to South Korean data, in the first quarter of this year, South Korea's exports to China fell to 5th place in its total exports, with the United States, Taiwan, Australia, and Japan gradually overtaking China, ranking in the top 4. For example, in the automotive industry, South Korea's exports to the United States have shown strong growth. In April, South Korea's exports to China reached 9.52 billion, while exports to the United States were 9.18 billion, with a difference of only 340 million. However, in January, the gap was 1.15 billion. This indicates that South Korea's export structure is gradually optimizing, with Korean products gaining a larger market share in the United States, showing a trend of gradually replacing the Chinese market. Why then are South Korea's exports gradually distancing themselves from the Chinese market? The reasons are actually not complicated. Over the past decade, South Korea has primarily sold intermediate products, but as local Chinese manufacturers have risen, the demand for these products has gradually decreased. For example, in the LCD and wireless communication equipment sectors, China is now capable of independent production and no longer requires large imports from South Korea. Additionally, South Korean companies that previously invested in China have gradually relocated their production facilities to Southeast Asia, further reducing the demand for intermediate products from South Korea. China's recent economic situation has a strong connection to South Korean companies considering exiting the Chinese market. China's high-end and high-growth model have demonstrated their inherent risks, ranging from debt issues in large property enterprises and the collapse of rural banks to the challenges of widespread unemployment and local government debts. In such circumstances, the risks associated with continued reliance on the Chinese market have become evidently too high for South Korean enterprises. Analysis of a variety of data show that China's GDP in the first quarter of this year actually contracted by 10% compared to the previous year, far from the 3 to 4.5% growth rates declared by official figures. This assessment is done by analyzing various data such as wage levels in the Yangtze River Delta region, Shanghai's export container index, satellite luminosity, subway passenger flow in 13 cities, logistics on highways, and South Korea's chip exports to China, which dropped by 41% on a year-on-year basis, and many other data on all fronts. China's real economic situation has compelled South Korean businesses to respond, and the outcomes of their efforts are encouraging. Take Samsung, the world's largest mobile phone brand, for example. In the first quarter of 2014, Samsung held a substantial 20% share of the Chinese smartphone market. However, that figure has now dwindled to around 1%. Nevertheless, Samsung has maintained its position as the global leader in sales for 11 consecutive years. This fact indirectly demonstrates that the much-touted vast Chinese market propagated by the Chinese government may be nothing more than an illusion. Exiting the Chinese market does not spell the end of the world. South Korea can thrive even without it. In reality, the fundamental reason behind South Korea's declining trade with China lies in its own development strategy. Under the current president, Yoon Suk-yeol, a shift occurred in the balance strategy between China and the United States, leading South Korea to move away from China and align with Washington in the anti-communist camp. This transformation is influenced by several factors. Firstly, in the past 3 years during the COVID pandemic, dissatisfaction among South Koreans towards China has surged. Surveys show that South Koreans hold the most negative views of China among 56 nations surveyed. Such sentiments and public opinion undoubtedly influence the South Korean government's policies towards China. Secondly, Seoul is well aware that without China's assistance, resolving the North Korean nuclear issue or even achieving Korean Peninsula reunification will be nearly impossible. However, from the initial China-led six-party talks to the present, the North Korean nuclear issue remains unresolved, and North Korea has become a nuclear-armed state. Seoul believes that China's favoritism towards North Korea has hindered genuine efforts to address the North Korean nuclear issue. As a result, Seoul has chosen to draw closer to Washington and strengthen its military alliance with the United States to deter North Korea. The third factor is Seoul's own strategic ambitions. It aspires to become the host country of the Global Democratic Summit and a global hub nation, contributing to freedom, peace, and prosperity. Under these expectations, Seoul has repositioned its relationship with China. South Korea will assert its position on sensitive issues involving China to highlight its own values and status. In recent years, South Korean businesses have seen their exports to China shift from a surplus to a deficit. South Korea's exports to China have continued to decline, and its share of total exports has decreased as well. As a result, South Korea has actively sought to expand into the European and American markets. Overall, the reduction in South Korea's product exports to China is not solely the result of market factors, but rather influenced by China's economic environment and South Korea's own development strategy. This trend is expected to continue over the next 1 to 2 years, further decreasing South Korea's total exports to China. Recent reports from the Wall Street Journal reveal that China's share of imports in the United States has dropped to 15.4% as of April this year, the lowest point since October 2006. This reflects the economic decoupling trend between China and the United States as global supply chain restructuring steadily progresses. South Korea has been included as a partner in the American semiconductor supply chain and is gradually distancing itself from China. In late April, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol visited the United States, and the two sides issued a series of documents, including the United States Republic of Korea Leaders Joint Statement and the Joint Statement on Launching the Next Generation Critical and Emerging Technologies Dialogue. Both countries have pledged to increase investment and cooperation in emerging technology fields such as semiconductors, batteries, clean energy, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. In the National Security Strategy document released on June the 7th this year, the Yoon Suk-yeol administration explicitly stated the government intends to change South Korea's overly reliant economic structure on China and enhance its autonomous and balanced capabilities, particularly in high-tech areas. At the same time, South Korea aims to achieve integration with the United States and Japan, realizing its strategic goal of becoming a technology-driven nation. However, such policy shifts have not been without resistance. Some critics argue that decoupling from the Chinese economy may have negative implications for South Korea's economy. Nevertheless, the Yoon Suk-yeol administration remains firm in its belief that China's economic policies and political stance may pose a threat to South Korea's economic and security interests. Therefore, South Korea needs to establish closer relations with the United States and other countries, seeking new avenues for commercial and national development. When it comes to battery and semiconductor companies in South Korea, their market shares in China and the United States are quite comparable. If the markets of the United States and its allies further develop, they can compensate for the trade decoupling between South Korea and China. On the other hand, the United States is rallying global powers to create an industry and supply chain akin to a club, causing significant disruption to China's international technological cooperation and high-tech production. According to YTN TV in South Korea, the total value of semiconductor equipment sold by China to South Korea was only 1.37 billion last year, a 40% decrease from 2.258 billion in 2021. In the first quarter of this year, South Korea's chip exports to China plummeted by 44.5% year-on-year. If this trend continues, South Korea's chip exports to China over the past 2 years, from last year to this year, may decrease by at least 65%. Moreover, insiders have told Bloomberg that the South Korean government will not allow domestic companies to supply chips to China after Micron Technology faced Chinese sanctions. Facing the challenge of chip supply shortages, China is also seeking solutions. In recent years, China has driven aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy, triggering intense strategic competition with the United States. This has prompted Japan to undergo strategic transformation, South Korea to reposition its national strategy, and accelerate the development of the US-Japan-South Korean Iron Triangle relationship. However, the United States does not anticipate conflict or war with China, and Japan and South Korea also hope to establish constructive and stable relations with China. Therefore, the Iron Triangle relationship between the United States, Japan, and South Korea is primarily defensive, aimed at preventing instability from China and North Korea. While maintaining deterrence, Japan and South Korea are also pushing for the establishment of a trilateral free trade area with China, easing the tension between China and the United States. Following this line of thinking, President Yoon Suk-yeol is actively pro-US, pro-Japan, and anti-North Korea, whilst also adjusting South Korea's policy towards China. At the ASEAN +3 APT summit in November last year, where leaders from China, Japan, South Korea attended, he openly stated that as a host country of this year's trilateral summit, South Korea will fully promote the realization of trilateral cooperation mechanisms. President Yoon refused to meet with U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, but hosted Chinese National People's Congress Chairman Li Zhanshu with high protocol, showing his expectations for China. As long as China can show respect for the concerns of Japan and South Korea, both countries still hope for progress in negotiations for trilateral free trade area. Senior officials recently dispatched by China explicitly stated the 4 non-negotiables during their visit to South Korea. Are these attitudes from China exacerbating the problem rather than solving them? In reality, China's motives for establishing a trilateral free trade area with Japan and South Korea significantly differ from these two countries. Firstly, China seeks to gain economic benefits. Secondly, China aims to use the free trade area to exert controls over Japan and South Korea, and thereby breaking the trilateral relationship between Japan and the United States and South Korea. The process of decoupling between the United States, Japan, Europe, away from China, has further intensified the tension between the two camps. China should understand that a confrontational diplomatic policy cannot bring long-term benefits. True prosperity and progress must be based on mutual respect and win-win cooperation, rather than a zero-sum approach.